Water. Be it a serene lake, a rushing river, or even just a gentle trickle of a waterfall, it plays a pivotal role in enhancing the visual appearance of our landscape photos. It's not just a static element, it can become the very essence of movement and motion within our compositions. As photographers, we're naturally drawn to shooting water in landscapes and making it a central focus of the composition. There's just something inherently captivating about the presence of water in our frames and the infinite things we could do with them. But of course, like all photography, shooting water comes with its own set of challenges. Controlling exposure to capture the right amount of detail with the water, but also the surrounding landscapes to keep it crisp and sharp. Additionally, the dynamic nature of water itself introduces complexities when it comes to framing and composition and capturing that perfect shot that's in your head. Finding the right shutter speed is also key to crafting that desired water effect. Too high and it can look like a blurred water. Too low and it just becomes a fine mist and takes away all detail from the photo. Understanding how to shoot long exposures for landscape photography will save you a lot of time in the field in going out there with the right equipment and the right mindset and the right skills to be able to apply it and save you time to capture exactly what you want. Also so that you're not disappointed that when you come back to the studio, what you've got in frame is actually blurred, is unfocused, and you've got to go out and do it all again. So if you're ready to elevate your landscape photography game, stick around and let's go through some tips on how we can shoot water. Now, before we go into equipment and settings and how to take these shots, let's talk about tip number one, which is patience. When you're doing this type of photography, you've got to be patient. You can't just set up, take the shot and go down. You need to make sure you grab multiple shots, especially when you're dealing with water, because it's going to look different every time you take it. If you're taking a waterfall, maybe you get similar results, but when you've got water kind of flowing over something, it's chaotic. Every time you press that shutter button, it's going to give you a completely different result. So you need to be patient and have the time to be able to sit there for a while and find the perfect settings for what you're trying to craft and then take multiple shots. My general rule is when I've found a shot that I really liked in camera, instead of kind of stopping and packing it up, I'll press it again. And I'll generally take about 10 more shots. And that's just because I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe I find something that becomes better than the one that I've taken. Take this one here, for example. This was the composition I was trying to line up, and then as I moved through all the various different shutter speeds to find one where I liked the water doing exactly what I could see in my head. And even once I'd settled on it, I'd then continue to just keep taking, and each time every result is different, until ultimately I finally settle on the photo that I was happy with, which became this final image here. Now looking at that, I can't predict how the water's going to fall. I couldn't predict these kind of little waterfall bits coming off of the rocks there. I purely had to wait and keep taking the photo. Same goes for all kind of landscape photography. When you sit up, you want to wait for that light to be just right. If you've got a cloud going by, wait for it to pass, get your sunlight, get your natural light back in. It's a bit of a patience game, and it's number one because you've got to practice patience to get to the settings and the equipment, which is next. Tip number two then is what equipment to use. So first of all, when you're going out here, you need to try and get everything as stable as possible. When we're dealing with long exposures and water, and even if we're just pushing things down towards that sort of 1 second mark, you need your shot to be really steady. And whilst cameras have a lot of built-in stabilizations these days, using a good tripod is always the best way to go, and you can guarantee it's going to be stable. So invest in a good tripod. I always have one every time I go out, just strapped to the side of my back, because I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and it's at home. Having that good tripod means you can always take those shots you want. But alternatively, you can always find little tripods as well, and GorillaPods. Now these are great if you want to get nice and low to subject, or maybe you've got a small waterfall, small kind of trickling stream, and you want to shoot something really low. These work very well. However, if it's a windy day, when you've got a lot of weight on these, the camera can still move from side to side, and it will bring back in that destabilization and make your shot potentially a bit blurry. But they do work really well, and as a bonus, a lot of them come with a phone attachment, so you can also use these for your phones, and then you could put this on your main tripod and you could always capture long exposures on your phone too. And again, whilst most phones can do these, there are some apps out there. The one I really like to use is Re-Expose. This is a great one with a lot of different options in there so that you can take the night photos, take the light trails. It kind of sets it all up for you. So that's a really cool app, and I'll put the link in the description below. Beyond a tripod, the next thing is an ND filter. Now I use a variable ND filter, which basically is just one of these lenses where you can pop it onto your camera and all it does is block out some of the light. So when we talk about the settings next, it's a real careful balance between exposure. You want your shutter speed to take priority, but equally you want to make sure that you're capturing the right level of details in the surrounding landscape. Therefore, you don't want to be doing the balance too much and sacrificing one or two of those areas. ND filters help us to control that light that's coming into the camera. Again, always have one of these in my pocket when I'm shooting because I never know when I'm going to use it, and if the sun comes out, they can help a lot for video as well. If you're able to, try and have a remote shutter button. That's going to help reduce any sort of shock impact when taking the image, but that one's not essential. We'll talk about how we can do that in point 3 now, which is the settings. Your settings then is the balance and action you need to do to get this exposure right. Make sure that your image is nice and sharp, and also make sure that you're getting the desired effect that you want. We mentioned shutter speed has to take priority here because ultimately changing your shutter speed with water is what's going to produce different types of results each time. So let's revisit back to these photos here and look at a couple of shutter speed examples. So this one was trying to capture, you can see how the water froths around the edges, and this is just 1/200th of a second, so it's just a freeze frame. And what I'm after is trying to get these kind of foamy parts to blend more, and also how it hits the rocks to kind of flow off of it. If we move it down, you can see we go into, this one is 1/4 of a second here. Now we start to get that smoothing of the water, however it doesn't quite look pleasing. It just kind of looks like the image is blurred around the outside and not really the effect we want. We want to look like clouds almost. When we push it to 1/5 of a second here, and we can see that we've got a little bit more of the wisp coming in, and this was clearly more of a violent wave, which brings us back to the point of patience of these two are not too far away from each other in shutter speeds. However, because the water hit differently when the photo was taken, we have produced two slightly different results with the clouds here. So let's start to push it even further down to 0.6 second shutter speed here then. And this is much nicer. Now we're starting to get this kind of cloud-like form across the water there. And if we do another photo with it, we can see the water's hit nicely and it's just looks like wafers of cloud across. So for this kind of style, like capturing that foamy water, 0.6 can be a real nice one. Let's go really far down now to a shutter speed of 2 seconds. And you'll see with this one here, we've lost kind of that movement of detail in the water, and now it's starting to enter that mist territory. So whilst it does still look really nice, if your aim with this is to create more of like negative space and really blend all this out, then going down into sort of a 2 second will work really well. And that would more mean that if I was dealing with this, the water wouldn't necessarily become my subject, but instead the rock formation here would be the thing I'm focusing on, and by having a bit more of a mist around the outside, that's composition is going to be more of that negative space there. If we go even further down into 3.2 seconds, we can see it's becoming just a bit finer on the mist. And again, we're going to get different results each time with this. So there is no correct shutter speed to go for. It's just going to produce slightly different things, and you're not going to know until you're in front. What I would recommend doing is starting at 0.6 with water and then just going all the way up to 3 seconds if your camera allows for it, and just see what results you're getting. Take a few photos on each one and move your shutter speed, and then whichever one you're favoring, stick with that one, and that's the one I would want you to take lots and lots of shots on. So for me, I ended up switching this composition over into portrait instead of a landscape. I took this photo with the 3.2 seconds on because I was favoring that at the time, and I finally caught something where the water flowed nicely over it, and you can see here all of these little moments where the water just sort of trickles off the rocks, and I really like that, but it now just looks a bit like fog passing over and you can't see the details of the water leaving the rocks too much. So that pushed me to keep the composition the same, keep everything else the same, but change my shutter speed back down to 0.6. And that's where I ended up with this photo, where you can see now that the water is leaving the rocks in the same way, but instead of looking more like a mist, you can now see it almost looks like miniature waterfalls just falling off the rock, and the direction of the water is showing. We've basically captured that movement, that flow of the water, and that itself can become like leading lines in the composition. And it's given us something extra to stare at on that side of the frame as well, where we have that little waterfall falling across now. Whilst I'm not going to talk about editing, let me know if you like the edit on this picture, and I will do a video on how I edit this kind of moody style. You saw how bright this was when I took it, but I really like creating these kind of pieces for like canvases. So let me know in the comments below, do you want to see how this photo is edited? When it comes to doing waterfalls, I generally will have my shutter speed a bit quicker. So you can see this one here is taken with 1/5 of a second. And as we zoom in, the water again, you can see more definition in the lines, and you can see the movement of the waterfall. If you go higher, you can get that nice silky smooth approach, but I'm also looking lower down in the frame and making sure that I didn't want all of this water blurred out, because I want to be able to still see some lines and direction in the water here. And this can be the thing that's missed out with shutter speed. Sometimes you want to just go really high and capture that cool silky smooth approach, but you got to look elsewhere in the competition. If your aim is to try and capture that movement, the life of the image, you're still going to want some of this detail to show in the water. So whilst this looks nice and smooth, as we move down the frame, we can still see elements of how the water is moving through the image. And on our F number here, you can see that this one was shot at an f13. So generally with landscapes, I tend to stick around f11 because I want to capture everything nice and sharp. And with this image in particular, there's a lot of depth to it. So you can see there's a lot more rocks and things in the background. And I want to make sure as I zoom in on these rocks, that I've still got them nice and sharp and crisp in the background there. So that's why I've pushed this up to f13. And I'll know this was worked because when I zoom in, the water is nice and flowing, but when I come over to the rocks, there's no motion blur there at all. And that really comes to how we're going to set up the shot, which is our next tip. But before we move on there, think of your ISO. Again, this one shot at 125. I generally try to keep it as low as possible, around 100, and then just control the light coming into the camera using the ND filter. So now's the point to say, if you are finding some value in this, please do subscribe. This is the first video of 2024 for me, and I got a lot more to come, and I got some real exciting directions to kind of bring the channel this year to sort of expand away from just doing the edits and photography and more into the business side of how do you sell your prints, how do you sell your work online as well. So if that's something that really interests you, again, let me know areas you're struggling with down in the comments, subscribe, and those videos will be coming out soon. Your final tip today then is how to set up this whole shot. So we've got our equipment and we've got our settings, we've got some patience behind us. How do we put it all together? Again, composition wise, we've talked about this. First of all, decide, are you making the water your focal point? So within the waterfall example here, the water's become the focal point, or are you making it more of a negative space and your focus point is an object like some rocks or a tree, something else in the image? Decide what that is, and that's going to help influence what settings you choose for the shutter speed. But again, I would advise just taking a range of shutter speeds, and that way you are going to be surprised maybe which one you like, and then double down on it and take your photos there. As far as setting up the shot goes, make sure you've got your tripod grounded nice and stable first, pop the camera on and add your ND filter. As far as coming down into settings on the actual camera itself, you want to switch over into a manual focus. Now this is because we're going to use timers, water can move, you want to make sure that you're focusing on the correct point. So manually focus on your area and make sure autofocus is turned off on your camera. If your camera lens has a stabilization on it as well, make sure that is also turned off. Imagine you don't want mid-shot, if your camera is taking a photo over 3 seconds and something moves on the camera and it tries to stabilize it, it's actually going to have a worse effect. So the camera is going to be nice and stable from how you set it up. Make sure that is turned off. If it's a real windy day, try and block the camera from the direction of the wind with your body, or you can go low to the ground with the smaller tripods. That can work as well. Once you've manually focused and you've turned off the stabilization, if your screen can do it, use the touch screen. So I use Canon cameras. When you touch it, you can take the photo. That's going to reduce the shock impact of pressing down the shutter button and taking the photo. Which brings us to the next point of having a timer set. I generally have just a 2-second timer and I use the touchscreen. If you're using a remote, then you don't have to worry about this too much. But you want to reduce any sort of shock impact into the camera. So you don't want to set all of this up and then press the shutter down. Imagine the camera takes the photo and moves slightly as you've pressed it. Well, you've already got some motion blur introduced. So you want to make sure that you're doing as much as possible to reduce anything touching the camera, any sort of shocks to bring in. And that can also include depending on the surface you're stood on. If you're stood on a floorboards or a surface that might move, even you just stepping back from the camera could tilt the tripod slightly. Now these might sound like real minuscule things, but it's those details that will show when you go to blow your print up into massive canvases. You want to do everything as possible to make it nice and sharp. So to recap there, manual focus on, stabilization off, tripod ND filter on there, pop a timer on. If you've got a remote button, that's okay. And if you can try and take the photo from the LCD screen. If you don't have that option, then do a longer timer, whether it's 5 seconds, 10 seconds, do a longer timer on there. It might be a pain, but it's going to be worth it. You don't want to get back, take these photos that look good on the camera, pop them on your computer and realize you've got that blur. Finally, another thing you can do is put on multi-shoot. By putting on a multi-shoot, your camera is going to take a few images at a time. Remember, you're dealing with something that is very dynamic, therefore you can't predict when to press the shutter, especially if you've got timers on. If you're capturing a wave coming in, you almost want to press the shutter button before the wave hits. Having a multi-shot setup is, again, just giving you more of a chance of actually capturing the thing that you want. So there you go, that's a few tips then on to introduce water in your landscape images and try and get them looking nice and sharp. I hope this has helped you out. Again, first video of 2024 here. Please do subscribe, like, comment. We got a lot of exciting stuff coming, and I'll see you in the next one.